Welcome back to Faith on Film, where we raid your church library in search of the good stuff. I'm Nathan.
I'm Stephanie, and it is time to talk about one of the big ones. And I mean big. This is a 6-hour miniseries with an all-star cast.
Everybody's invited. Christopher Plummer, Rod Steiger, Michael York, Peter Ustinov, Laurence Olivier, James Mason, Anthony Quinn.
This is the final installment of Italian Jesus Lent, by the way.
Ferrantino, Ian McShane, and Bancroft.
Okay, Nathan, you made your point.
And appearing as the Magi are Dr. Loomis, Frog One, and Darth Vader themselves. That's right, James Earl Jones as one of the Magi, which makes it weird that they gave that character the line, "Crucify him."
Nathan, that's from Conan the Barbarian.
That makes so much more sense.
Now, all-star casts in and of themselves are nothing new, and were a very common practice, especially for the big biblical epics of that time. And we've seen it before in movies like The Ten Commandments and The Greatest Story Ever Told. Now, in The Greatest Story Ever Told, this was considered something of a problem. So, why would this one be any different? Well, I think the key difference is, in The Greatest Story Ever Told, you had all these big-name actors, but you had very little for them to actually do. Thus, they just kind of came and went, and their involvement in this movie was more of a glorified cameo. Plus, seriously, who thought John Wayne as a centurion was a good idea? He's a cowboy! There's all-star casting, and there's smart all-star casting. All of these people have, at one time or another, either been in a Shakespeare play or in a biblical adaptation of some sort, thus their appearance here isn't completely out of place. They look kind of natural here. They are written in such a way that even guys like Ernest Borgnine, who are only in it for maybe 1 or 2 scenes tops, really get to show their stuff, get to bring their best to the table, and really get to make their performance a full character.
And how do you balance all of those characters? Well, how about you get a trio of well-respected writers to work together? You got Anthony Burgess, who wrote the Clockwork Orange, the book, not the movie. Zeffirelli had adapted Shakespearean texts multiple times, and there was Suso Cuccio D'Amico,
Who wrote Bicycle Thieves.
I want it!
Nathan, finish the review, and you can watch it.
Fine. Zeffirelli, as you may have noticed from our secondary theme song, is also directing. And he'd made a name for himself adapting several Shakespearean plays before this, including that Romeo and Juliet you may have watched in high school. And get a good look at Juliet there, because she's going to be our Virgin Mary.
Producer Lou Grade is sparing no expense here. The Pope personally requested that this miniseries be made, and by golly, he is going to get what he asked for.
With all that said, let's dive into Jesus of Nazareth with our trusty Jesus movie checklist. First up is Exposition. And the first thing you'll notice is that this is a very lived-in version of Palestine. It's a thoroughly believable set. Everything's dusty and worn down, but still functional.
Basically, gone are the days of the big, lush, shiny, elaborate sets of the biblical epics of yore, and I think I prefer it this way.
Fun fact, some of these sets were recycled 2 years later for Monty Python's Life of Brian.
There's a lot of talk in Act 1 about the Messianic prophecy and everything that it might mean, but if I was going to sum up this movie's exposition in one scene, I would actually go a little later to a scene where Jesus is a boy. During his bar mitzvah, some Roman soldiers come riding through town looking for some bread. The helpless villagers bemoan how God has abandoned them, and one villager drops to his knees screaming, "How long must we wait, O Lord, for you to help us?" Cut to boy Jesus.
That's a fantastic way to sum up what could be an hours-long discussion, but allow us to fill it out with a few more details. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, in chronological order, God goes from a regular fixture of people's lives to the point that he will show up to have dinner with Abraham, to not even being mentioned in the book of Esther. And a significant turning point in that development is in 1 Kings. When Elijah goes to Horeb, God says, "I will pass by." And then an earthquake, a fire, and a great wind all happen, but the narrator says that God was not in any of them. Then it says there was a small, still whisper. An alternate translation of that phrase is the sound of a thin hush, aka silence. When God appears, it's in utter silence. It is only after this point that the northern kingdom gets shuffled off by Assyria, and the southern kingdom off by Babylon, changed hands a few times, and then winds up under Roman occupation. The Roman occupation is really just a symptom of a larger problem to the Jews at the time. Their God is gone. But there was a refrain shared by at least two contemporary prophets, which is quoted here by John the Baptist, "Return to me, and I will return to you." The coming of Jesus is emblematic of God returning to his people. And that's why it is so significant that the last lines of the entire miniseries are, "I am with you to the end of time."
That doesn't mean that the elements of the supernatural are really in your face or bombastic. It's kind of been a reoccurring theme this Jesus Lent that the miracles are all very low key. This works to the miniseries' advantage. As we've talked about before, special effects are constantly in flux and are being outdated constantly. Instead of a big booming voice coming down from the sky during the baptism scene, John the Baptist says, "Lord God, I hear your voice. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," while a dove flies overhead. Or the depiction of the Annunciation. This scene is just as gorgeous today as it was in 1977.
Because the rest of the miniseries is so grounded in reality, it makes the simple effects of the supernature feel much bigger than they actually are.
The more I look at different Bible movies, the more I've come to the conclusion that there are stylistically one of two directions that a given director can really choose to feature. For simplicity, let's call them left and right. Left is deliberately trying to mimic the styles of different paintings, like Renaissance art in particular, trying to mimic the style, look, feel, and tone of iconic works of art. A good example of this would be in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. The costume design for the priests is a very good example of going left. Then there's going right, which is really trying to make your world look and feel as close to real life first century Israel as you can possibly get, from your set design to your costume choices. Everything's grounded. You'll find that basically all movies fall somewhere in between left and right.
And when it tries to do both at the same time, the two styles clash. And then there's occasions where it thinks it's doing one, but it's actually doing the other. Like the Passion of the Christ.
Now, speaking of the Passion of the Christ, this is actually a very good example of that implied violence that we talked about.
You're not going to cite Psycho again, are you?
Well, I would use Strangers on a Train once in a while, but have you seen it?
No.
Exactly.
Herod the Great is played here by Sir Peter Ustinov. And Ustinov is great at playing up Herod's paranoia about losing his power.
When representatives of Rome come in and ask him to take up a census, he goes from being this at-large and in-charge kind of a guy to kowtowing really just within under a minute.
But when it's a baby that's his opposition, he goes all out. He starts shouting, "This is my world! I will not share it with an infant! I will snatch down that star from the heavens!" And the Massacre of the Innocents takes place right on schedule.
It might not be Pasolini's in-your-face, babies flying everywhere, but it is still very effective and very unpleasant to watch. And then there's Herod Antipas, played here by Christopher Plummer. Ooh, Hey Nathan, we have Herodias to talk about.
Herodias' antagonism toward John is seeded early, even before we see Robert Powell. She's even seen assaulted by some of John's followers who shout at her that she's a whore. Which is to say, I get it. I wouldn't want someone encouraging people to treat me that way either.
Basically, Herodias being out to get John the Baptist doesn't happen in a vacuum. Then there's Salome. Whereas Rossellini and Pasolini played Salome off as innocent, manipulated by her mother, Franca Zeffirelli veers hard in the other direction. Salome is sexy and she knows it. Sorry, had to say it.
Not that there's anything wrong with being sexy, just maybe don't use it to get people beheaded, is all I'm saying.
Jasper Plummer's Herod Antipas took Herodias, who was his brother's wife, as his own, but that doesn't mean he's not interested in upgrading to a newer and younger model, if you know what I mean. Dude!
That's your stepdaughter! That too! And it's not like Herodias and Salome are unaware of this, because Antipas is not exactly subtle about it. This makes it all the easier to turn him on and get him to do whatever he wants, thus, John the Baptist.
While we're here, let's talk about Michael York as John the Baptist. This is another example of John the Baptist done right. He looks like a wild man, he shouts like a wild man, he most certainly has the fire and brimstone elements of John's teachings down pat, but he also knows how to turn it off and have softer, quiet moments with different characters as well.
Bonus points for making us believe that John and Jesus look like cousins. It really is a great performance and one of the best takes on John the Baptist. One of John's disciples goes off to recruit his brother Simon to become a follower of Jesus. And this is also a great Simon Peter. He's a real working man. I realize every Peter starts out as a common working man. But you really feel it here because of how much he doesn't want to give up his life as a fisherman because it's all he's always known. Then there's this new rabbi that his brother is following right after the previous one was put in jail, who wants him to forgive Matthew the tax collector with whom he has a long-standing enmity. This is not in the Gospels. However, it makes perfect sense in the context, both because they come from the same town and because of the social status that tax collectors had as race traders.
It really would have been awkward for Matthew to just up and join the other disciples. And this miniseries is very aware of that. It also happens that Jesus drew a lot of controversy for entering into the home of a tax collector, and it also just so happens that the parable of the prodigal son doesn't have a surrounding framing device like the parable of the Good Samaritan does. Why not put all those points together into one scene? Peter and Matthew both get the message right away. They form a friendship that holds up for the rest of the miniseries.
There is also a blink and you'll miss it cameo of James the Lesser as Matthew's brother. Well done, research department. Matthew and James are separately listed as son of Alphaeus.
Probably the biggest thing, though, about why this is such a well-written Peter, he really earns his status as being the rock upon which Jesus builds his church. This isn't just because he had the right answer during the Who Do You Say That I Am scene. In the course of the miniseries, you see Peter start to take charge in different situations. You start to see other disciples turn to him when they're uncertain about what to do. You see him try to stop the other disciples from running away during the Garden of Gethsemane scenes. And come Easter Sunday, he delivers a wonderfully impassioned speech to the other disciples.
One thing that bugs me is that he's called Peter right away, but then Jesus acts like it's a new nickname that he's giving him when he calls him Peter.
I always figured introducing him as Simon Peter from the get-go was there more for the benefit of the not as biblically savvy members of the audience watching at home.
I guess it just doesn't seem like enough to justify the inconsistency.
That's fair enough, but can we at least agree that the campfire scene is amazing?
Oh yes, and I particularly like how they integrate Judas's motivation in with canonical lines.
Talking about Judas now, aren't we?
Uh-huh.
Cool.
It's semi-popular in movies to depict Judas as a member of the sect known as Zealots. This is based on an interpretation of the word Iscariot, and there will be better times to get into that. That's not really this Judas. That Judas wants to push Jesus into action to fight against the Romans. This Judas sympathizes with the Zealots, but ultimately doesn't agree with them. In fact, his first scene is meeting with them to convince them to abandon their organization to join Jesus. This Judas's motive is more complex.
Judas is also a scholar, being able to read and write in several languages. This would work, seeing as the Gospels, Judas is the keeper of the communal purse. He's not quite the blue-collar guy that the others are. It makes sense. Ultimately, his intellect ends up being used against him. That's very clever.
This is just the best Judas I've seen. I'm sorry, Carl Anderson. You're still my favorite, but Ian's just better developed.
He wants Jesus to prove himself before the Sanhedrin so he can spread his message of him being the Messiah with the backing of the scribes and the Pharisees. And he's also kind of starting to have his doubts about whether or not Jesus really is who he says that he is. He kind of needs this to be confirmed in his own mind. This is what I meant about his intellect ultimately being used as part of his downfall. Now, this has drawn controversy over the years, as Judas, in the end, comes off a little bit more as a dupe who is tricked by this Pharisee named Zara. But I think depicting Judas this way makes him a little bit more of a cautionary tale to the audience. If you make him the clearly evil one from the get-go, the audience sitting at home could sit back and go, oh, well, I would never betray my friend. I'm not motivated by cowardice or greed. By playing him more as a man who has so much intellect, but is ultimately rather naive at the same time, it kind of plays more as, with just the right push from your adversary, the devil, you too, member of the audience, could betray Jesus.
Hey, the devil's not even in this mini-series.
Okay, maybe not literally, but may I? Around the 8th grade, I started to develop the theory that Sarah, played here by Ian Holm, was possibly the devil, or at the very least, the devil's advocate. He is introduced discussing Jesus and his ministry with Judas. He also sees Zara start to really push for getting Jesus in trouble with the Romans. Pilate even says to him at one point, why is he so dangerous? And Zara answers, if you knew him as we knew him, you would also consider him dangerous. He's the one advocating for soldiers guarding the tomb. First moments of the crucifixion, cut to Jesus on the cross, back to Zara pacing around. Final bit you'll notice is when Easter Sunday does come, Zara goes to the empty tomb, and he sighs in defeat and says, now it all begins. That is a lot of attention to detail for a fictional Pharisee.
And even Judas's other companion, Simon, doesn't get that much screen time.
That's right! Simon the Zealot gets a character arc here. How great is that? This is how far down the rabbit hole of attention to detail we're going. In the canonical Gospels, he's usually nothing more than a name on a list.
But they took that name and developed a whole personality around him.
Mm-hmm.
He's part of a group of zealots that concocts this plan to kill Herod Antipas to avenge John the Baptist. What?
Oh, I'm half expecting the Amen lady to come in and yell at us about how that subplot isn't in the Bible.
No. She's not talking to us right now.
Oh, okay, phew.
He also happens to leave the group around this time with Judas to go join Jesus. So he's also the one who survives to hear about all of his friends being brutally murdered. Empty chairs and empty tables, where my friends will meet no more.
At first I thought that this subplot kind of came and went and didn't really have much of an effect on what happens afterwards, but actually no. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that.
We have several other disciples worth talking about first.
Yes, we do.
Like Thomas. Tom doesn't really get much to do in the canonical Gospels. He has a couple speaking parts in John, but they're toward the end. So this movie's workaround is rather creative. In Luke, there's a scene where Jesus goes to heal Jairus' daughter, but he's met halfway by Jairus' servants who tell him to not bother because she's already dead. Here, that opposition becomes Thomas. I will grant you, it can be annoying when movies try to pad Thomas out by just having him not believe anything he sees. This works a little better because he admits a willingness to learn what he doesn't understand.
Another thing I want to talk about is the way this miniseries handles Martha of Bethany.
Must save Martha!
Thank you, Superman. This is one of the rare times where Martha of Bethany really does get her due. Much like Thomas has a tendency to only be remembered for the time he doubted, even though the Gospels have him saying other things, implying there are other aspects of his personality, Martha has a tendency to only be remembered for that one time she got really stressed out about the housework and yelled at Jesus to please make Mary help her. Mary of Bethany is often held up as the saintly innocent that all must aspire to be, while being a Martha is a bad thing. In fact, when I was a kid, I had a Sunday school teacher who said that when Jesus came to heal Lazarus, the ever-faithful Mary showed her faith again. Lord, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died, but I know even now, whatever you ask of God, he will give to you, because I believe that you are the Christ. While Martha just yelled at him for not coming. So you can imagine my surprise when I read John's Gospel later and learned that it was actually the other way around. Mary is the one that's just upset that Jesus didn't show up to heal Lazarus. Martha is the one who says, even now, whatever you ask of God, he will give to you. And I love the way Maria Carta delivers this line. She becomes the other named female character that we see later on in the miniseries, showing up at the crucifixion, showing up at the empty tomb. Now, Zeffirelli's decision to go with Martha instead of Mary might have simply been it's easier to have a Martha and two Marys than it is to have... Zeffirelli might have simply decided that it's easier to have two Marys and a Martha instead of three Marys, but it is something that I have come to appreciate. Being a Martha doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Let's talk about those other Marys. Magdalene is a prostitute. Gasp, shock, and awe. She follows the pretty standard beats for that depiction of the character, so nothing really newsworthy to tell you there. I like Anne Bancroft's portrayal. She has a very commanding presence when some young boys come to harass her for her occupation, and that contrasts nicely with when she breaks down crying when she goes to see Jesus.
It's a great performance from a great actress.
By the way, Dustin Hoffman was in the running to play Jesus.
Oh, thank goodness that didn't happen. You know how many graduate jokes we'd have to make?
Mrs. Magdalene, you're trying to seduce me.
Okay,
Well,
yeah.
that's the only joke, but you'd hear it a lot.
Mother Mary here is played by Olivia Hussey, who, as we mentioned earlier, had worked with Franco Zeffirelli previously on Romeo and Juliet. I've heard some people say that Hussey should have played Mary Magdalene and Anne Bancroft should have played Mother Mary. However, I don't think I quite agree. Mary really does start out as a very young girl, and there's just the right amount of age difference, I think, between her and Joseph. Yes, it is true, Olivia Hussey doesn't really age at all between Christmas and Easter Sunday. I'm going to blame that more on bad makeup than I am bad acting.
Olivia Hussey does distinguish well between the two ages, capturing both the innocence and, dare I say, naivete of youth, as well as the experience of middle age. She really makes the nativity portion come to life, which could have gone disastrously in the hands of a less capable actress.
You could almost cut out just the nativity portion of this miniseries and package it as its own Christmas special. There is enough details going on here, from Mary's mother Anna to Mary and Joseph's wedding, Mary encountering Elizabeth, Joseph's reaction to all of this, the scandal, the old rabbi, Jesus as a kid, the Magi meeting on the road instead of all coming together.
But don't do that, because that would be obviously money grubbing. The Bible the Epic Miniseries being repackaged as Son of God comes to mind. We'll get to you one day.
This miniseries also adds in having Mary meet the Apostle John before Good Friday, which makes sense. I mean, he is going to take her into his home later, so why not have them meet? I really do like this portrayal of John. He's so unabashedly earnest in everything that he says and does. I have no trouble buying that this guy is going to be the beloved disciple.
Back to Mary, it is a little odd that she gets no closure. I mean, we'd been following this woman from her youth until now, but
We kind of leave her in Pieta mode, don't we? It isn't required to give Mary a scene after Jesus' resurrection. I just find it kind of surprising that a miniseries made at the request of the Pope was allowed to get away with this. Maybe the thinking was they've included Simeon's prophecy about the sword piercing her heart, delivered rather creepily by Ralph Richardson, by the way, that I could see them thinking that having the sword pierce her heart and have that immediately be undercut just a few scenes later meant it wouldn't hold any weight. That's the best I got.
well, now let's talk about Joseph.
As in Mary's husband?
No, Joseph Caiaphas.
And don't confuse people at home.
Caiaphas is here played by Anthony Quinn, not to be confused with Barabbas, played by Anthony Quinn.
No. Stacy Keach plays Barabbas here.
He's a joke. Caiaphas presides over the Sanhedrin when they're called together to discuss the issue of Jesus rolling into town. The issue of whether or not Jesus is the Messiah seems to divide the court, but Caiaphas doesn't seem too interested in that question. He gets really disturbed, though, by Jesus' claims to be the Son of God, which he views as blasphemous.
He also says that Rome isn't going to wait for them to figure this out.
Yes, but that's really ancillary to his case. He's much more interested in getting Jesus killed as a false prophet, which isn't really his motive in any of the Gospels, but the writers integrated it well into this context, so I buy it.
And I also buy it because of Quinn's performance. I think the thinking also is Caiaphas is going to tear his robes in horror when Jesus answers, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" with "I am." So by having this be on Caiaphas' mind already before the trial, makes that action carry just a little bit more gravitas. Anthony Quinn might not be in this miniseries that long. He really only has the 2 scenes. But he makes those scenes worth the wait. He is a very good Caiaphas.
And alongside him are several other priests, including Nicodemus, played by Sir Laurence Olivier, and Joseph of Arimathea by James Mason. I, for one, like how the two are seated throughout the show. Joseph of Arimathea is in all 4 Gospels, but he only shows up to bury Jesus and is then never mentioned again. Arimathea in the show is among the guests at Simon the Pharisee's house when they have an audience with Jesus. There he proves himself to be the most open-minded to new ideas, at which point Jesus says, "You are not far from the kingdom of heaven, Joseph of Arimathea."
Ironically enough, the one thing that Joseph of Arimathea does do in the Gospels is missing from this miniseries. Oh, at least I think it is. When the trial starts, both James Mason and Laurence Olivier are seen being approached by different disciples and they both say that they'll do all they can to speak on Jesus' behalf. But then, after they send Jesus off to Pilate, only Nicodemus shows up again. When the Roman lieutenant was saying to Zara that Jesus was buried by someone of their council who didn't want their name to be revealed, I assume that means Joseph of Arimathea because I know the Bible, but looking at this miniseries, I can't help but think he actually means Nicodemus. I'm not sure I get why. Both characters had pretty similar character trajectories at this point. Since Nicodemus has the iconic scene with Jesus where John 3:16 comes up, maybe the thought process was Nicodemus finally putting together what Jesus meant by being born again would carry more weight if he carried Jesus alone. Or it might have been as simple as Laurence Olivier was grumpy that James Mason was getting more screen time because he's Laurence Olivier. I don't know. I don't quite get it. But at the very least, Laurence Olivier is a world-class actor, and he does make a good Nicodemus, so I guess I can't complain too much.
Joseph and Nicodemus are not the only good priests here. There are several other unnamed priests who will speak up for Jesus at the Sanhedrin. There's this one guy who doesn't seem that invested in Jesus personally, but he's open to hearing new prophets with groundbreaking ideas. You. I like you.
This miniseries does a lot of attention to detail into the extras. One example that springs to mind is this one extra running up to another extra in Mary's party on her way to Elizabeth's house, asking them to not forget to greet Aunt Esther. And Joseph is talking to the local rabbi. This other extra meanders up with his own problems that he wants to talk to the rabbi about, that the rabbi is going to have to address later. It makes it really feel like these everyday people strolling around in the background are characters with full lives and problems of their own. They're not just props in the scene for our main players to bounce off of. And it took me a couple of viewings to confirm this for sure, but yes, Franco Zeffirelli is actually using the same extras in different crowd scenes when the situation calls for it. As this guy here, and this guy here. This is not being lazy, this is attention to detail. We're in Jerusalem. It makes sense that the same people would be in these crowds.
Because we're in Jerusalem, let's go ahead and talk about Rod Steiger as Pilate. Pilate is only on the scene very briefly. He shows up on Good Friday to find a commotion going on, and then he's gone by the next day to leave his lieutenants to be the ones to actually post a guard at Jesus' tomb. You do you, Pilate, but being on site for the biggest religious festival of the contentious people that you govern should probably be higher on your list of priorities. I'm just saying, this is why you get removed from your post in a few years.
Rod Steiger was actually a last-minute replacement for the role of Pilate. They wanted this other guy, but they couldn't agree about money.
I really hope Zeffirelli went, you cannot serve both God and money, mic dropped, and then walked out of the room.
Nobody does grumpy quite like Rod Steiger. And this is a very grumpy Pilate.
Pilate, eat a Snickers. You're not you when you're hungry.
Who does he turn into afterwards?
I'm hoping David Bowie.
Well, anyway, back to Rod Steiger. Pilate is very tired. He says so 3 different times.
He just got back into town to find an angry mob, and he's leaving again in about 6 hours. I'd be tired too.
This mob is not actually here because of Jesus. Well, not yet, anyway. That comes later. Right now, they're here because of Barabbas. So, remember when I said earlier that the subplot about Simon the Zealot's friends was going to come back later? This is the big payoff. When it comes time for the infamous Give Us Barabbas moment, it's less of a, oh, how could these people choose this thug over Jesus? And more of a, oh, come on, Pilate, what did you think was going to happen?
Barabbas is given possibly his most sympathetic portrayal here, possibly. He actually goes to Jesus before either of them get in trouble, hoping to establish a dialogue and see if they have any common goals, and that's when Jesus tells him, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Does Barabbas have motivations that he takes too far? Well, yeah, probably. The Zealots would wind up angering Rome and getting Judea wiped off the map for centuries. Little whoopsie there. But he's much more understandable and human here, rather than just convenient target.
I know we promised that we wouldn't bring up anti-Semitism in regards to the Give Us Barabbas bit every time, but it just so happens that Franco Zeffirelli knew Mel Gibson. They had worked together on Hamlet. So naturally, when the Passion of the Christ rolled around, Franco Zeffirelli was asked what he thought of the movie. And he said that the Jews were responsible for all of that bloodshed. In this way, we have set ourselves back centuries. Boy, tell us how you really feel, Mr. Zeffirelli.
So how does Zeffirelli skirt around the same thing that he accuses Gibson of doing? Well, for starters, he makes it very clear that the Jewish community is not speaking with one unanimous voice, that they in fact have a multitude of opinions. The crucifixion is the action of a select few Jews, and even some of the same ones on that very council disagree with the action. And the Give Us Barabbas scene has a lot of people clamoring for Jesus' release, almost as many as there are for Barabbas.
My old babysitter always thought that this sounded like a tie.
It also helps that one line in particular is just not said at all.
That's okay.
Furthermore, they went out of their way to really emphasize Jesus' Jewishness. His parents have a very Jewish wedding. He is circumcised. He participates in the sacrificial system of the Second Temple. He talks about the paschal significance of the Last Supper. He attends synagogue regularly. And he has a bar mitzvah. That part is important because Zeffirelli was told multiple times that bar mitzvahs wouldn't really be a thing until a couple centuries after this. He insisted on keeping it in. He wanted to make a point about Jesus' continuity with his own race. If he had to sacrifice historical accuracy for just a quick moment, he was prepared to do it.
Once again, props to the casting department. I totally believe that kid is going to turn into Robert Powell when he grows up. Really did an interview before the release of this miniseries saying that his Jesus would be portrayed as an ordinary man. Gentle, fragile, simple. Are you sure she's not gonna...
Yeah, she's not talking to us today.
Oh, okay, phew. These quotes were taken to mean that this miniseries was going to deny the divinity of Christ. And evangelists such as Bob Jones III went into a frenzy, starting a letter-writing campaign to try to get the sponsorship for this miniseries dropped, having not even seen it.
Just goes to show that even before the internet blew up, overreacting to things that we knew very little about was already a thing.
And it's only gotten worse. So, then, having actually seen this miniseries, what would you say that Pirelli meant by those comments?
It's becoming a bit of a tired cliche now to claim that this or that film depiction of Jesus shows the human side of the man. Guys, we're all doing the same thing. Stop claiming to be different. Back in the 70s, this would have been a bit of a new phenomenon. Just look at the Jesus from the 60s, like King of Kings or The Greatest Story Ever Told. Bland, uninteresting, and generally afraid to show any kind of expression for fear of showing an ungodlike trait. However, H.B. Warner's Jesus had a full range of emotions. In 27, he had fear, he had anger, he felt sorrow, he felt happiness. This isn't even new on film.
I find it frustrating sometimes how people claim that there has never been a really human or relatable Jesus depicted on screen. I just find myself screaming sometimes, guys, what do you want? A Jesus that reacts to his deity and messiahship like this?
Being the Son of God is so hard. Why do I have to die? I should be the one who doesn't have to die. Everyone else can die, just not me. It's too much. No, 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 no.
That's not being human. That's being a psycho.
You weren't going to reference that movie anymore.
Somewhere along the line, we started conflating having emotions with over-the-top displays of emotion. Like, the only way to portray having humanity is to whine and to fly off the handle at the drop of a hat. Don't believe me? Just look at the Star Trek reboot's interpretation of Mr. Spock compared to his original counterpart.
And that's what makes it so impressive that Jesus does have all these layers of emotions.
There's nuance here.
There is nuance, but he keeps them under control. In this way, he's actually a good example of a Stoic.
No, Nathan, not you two.
No. Capital S, not lowercase.
Oh, okay.
Stoics were a Greco-Roman philosophy about maintaining a well-ordered mind. It also so happens that they were a large influence on the early church. Look at in the beginning was the Word, the Gospel of John. That word, logos, in Greek, was originally a Stoic term. The Stoics didn't deny emotions or try to not have any, they just managed them. And that's this Jesus to a T. And now it's time to talk about the home releases. For reasons I don't fully understand, the UK airing dropped 9 minutes of the total runtime, most of it related to Judas's arc. This cut is what Shout Factory put out.
40th Anniversary Edition. The complete miniseries. Missing 9 minutes. I don't think I've ever been more disappointed in a DVD purchase in my entire life. Sarah says, I think I know the way to reach him. And then you just cut to Judas sneaking out somewhere with no in-between. Why cut that stuff? Wouldn't trimming a miracle or something make more sense? I love Italian Jesus Lent, but it's these DVD releases I can't stand. I want my VHS tapes back.
For those on the lookout for an actual complete miniseries, look up the Artisan release. It also doesn't claim that, ironically.
Hey, go figure. So I guess it's time for a rating.
Yes. I'm going to go ahead and give this a money's worth. It's well shot, well edited, well directed, well lit. Just pretty much everything about it is quite good. It's not as good as St. Matthew, but I think it could certainly give it some competition.
And that's the reason why I think I'm going to go ahead and give this one practically perfect in every way as well. Now, hear me out. We have talked ad nauseum on our little show about the inherent disadvantage that television often has compared to the movies. The special effects are always going to be more low budget. The actors are often looking for bigger and better things because TV is the lesser art form, don't you know? And the music is very often very cheap and maybe on a synthesizer. It's very seldom very good. Here, all-star talent in front of and behind the camera. You even have a very good score written by French composer Maurice Jarre. That is still rare for network television. HBO doesn't count! My point is, it is very rare for television adaptations to not only be as good as their big screen counterparts, but in some cases, better. You look at some of these TV remakes that were made in the 90s of classic movies that they are terrible, and there is no good reason for them to be.
Franco Zeffirelli built this in the 70s with a box of scraps.
Jesus of Nazareth is a testament to just how good the medium of television is capable of being. It is no wonder that this miniseries has continued to be a tradition around the world during Christmas and Easter.
You mean Resurrection Sunday, young lady?
It's the Resurrection Rabbit!
Right you are. And I have a special Resurrection Sunday surprise for both of you because you've worked so hard this past year.
You're rewarding us for hard work? What kind of Protestant are you?
Boy, we've been at this for over a year already.
Behold! The Apostle!
Robert Duvall's The Apostle! I love this one!
From all of us at Faith on Film, thank you for joining us. I'm Nathan.
I'm Stephanie. Happy Easter, everyone. Okay.
I'm gonna wait for these cards to pass.
I'm gonna go like this time.
Good. I think that ought to do it.
Ferrantino. All those other people.
That's good.
Nope. Let's go ahead and give it a rating.
Oh, Artisan. Artisan Easter.
Alright, let's do one more thing. First I had to carve things, and then I had to put them together, and then I had to stop doing that. And then I miss working with wood. I don't want to be nailed to it. That's just too much.
It's the Resurrection. Just get on with it.
Like maybe he's the drunk Resurrection Rabbit.
And then there's this guy, and he's gonna kiss me, and I'm not even into him. Ah!
We're almost there.
Oh, we're almost there.
Saying that his Jesus would be betrayed. I said betrayed. Oopsies.
Well, I mean, you're not wrong.
You want to do that one more time?
Not really.